Namaste, disciples, devotees, and seekers, to Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste and welcome to everyone.
Tonight is one of the topics that have been most prominent in my consciousness for many, many months. Current affairs, global destruction.
Disruption.
Disruption, not destruction.
It is.
Although we're close.
It is.
So please listen carefully, everyone. This is a very important evening.
Yes. Narad and I have off and on discussed things whenever we meet. And one of the first comments I hear from Narad is, so much has happened, so much is happening. And it's actually so complex, with such rapidity, with always so much uncertainty, that we don't know where things are going. We don't know what will happen even a few days away. That kind of pace of change is always, for many, alarming. But also from a spiritual point of view, it offers a potential for rapid shifts. The kind where you have the battle on the edge of forces of for evolution and against evolution, but also from a situation of uncertainty where everything is as if on the edge. The slightest tilt, the slightest intervention from either side can make for rapid and lasting changes. So we are at one of those junctures on so many levels, social, economic, political, and of course, fundamentally at a spiritual level. And it's difficult to keep up because of the level of uncertainties involved. But I will start with a couple of questions which have been pending for a while, and I will use the questions as a starting point for the discussion. First, Maya had asked, would it be possible to share insights on the current global churning, realignment, and trade tariff wars? So the tariff wars have been going on now for several months. Even if the US regrows its homegrown industries in the long run and improves national security, what are the long-term implications on America's global leadership? It appears their soft power is rapidly declining. In contrast, India's positive public relations and agreements, most recently with Sri Lanka, UAE, are attracting a lot of attention, and it is trying its best to rise under extremely turbulent conditions. Could you speak of how current trends are fulfilling Sri Aurobindo's predictions of the world order and India? To what extent does the future success of India rely on the ability of the dragon and the elephant to tango? Dragon representing China, elephant is maybe one way of describing India. But both, you see, are massive. And so any small shift can make massive implications. There's another question of Sumana, which I will take up later, which will be the leap off for a more detailed discussion, of which these issues will also be looked at. But I want to make a few rapid, quick comments. And one of the most important here is, do not trust mainstream media. The media is blatantly lying to you. If we get time today, I would like to read from an example of how they make up stories and utterly bias information. Recently, though, the BBC has come under serious investigation, including by the US government, for statements that they quoted of Trump, which were totally made up. Totally made up. Then this is relating to what happened in January 6th in 2020 elections, just before the power shift took place. Trump had a speech outside the US Congress where he told, supposedly, and this is what the media projected, and BBC said, Trump said, let's go to the Capitol and push our agenda and force them, threaten them. Effectively, he triggered the invasion of people walking into the Capitol. That's the story. In fact, what he said was, let's go there and represent to the politicians our need to protect whatever, something to those words. And some other statements which were later in the speech, the BBC took these first half from this statement, a sentence, another half from another sentence, which was 15 minutes later, joined them, spliced them together to make it seem as if Trump gave an order to go and invade the Capitol. This is totally made up. And this is serious, very serious. It's because that was the basis of still an idea people have that it was because of Trump that that situation took place. And this has come under investigation for the first time. And you can see how the mainstream media is even suppressing the fact that this is under investigation. But I'm coming to something bigger. Don't trust mainstream media. So you see in Maya's question, where she's saying it appears their soft power, US soft power, is rapidly declining. And I'll say simply one example. Look at what happened when Trump visited Japan or Korea recently. And you see how the prime ministers of these countries gave him the highest honor, which they never give to other heads of state, gave them awards, medals of, unfortunately, I don't remember the terms, but what represents the highest honor for the government to a visiting head of state, never given to others. And that's telling you something interesting, that the actual soft power, not what media tells you, but what actually countries look at in relation to Trump or the US under Trump, is totally different from the image the media creates. And so look for evidence which is objective in such moves rather than what the media would tell you. It also happened quite recently when there was a meeting in China, and the way the Chinese representatives met with the Trump government or with Trump, the meeting between Xi and Trump and what took place there. Look at what happened, look at the protocols followed, look at the honors given, which otherwise do not exist in their diplomacy. And more recently, there was an event where Prime Minister Narendra Modi had gone, Indian Prime Minister had gone to China for a meeting. And suddenly in the middle of that, we find something very odd took place. Modi was waiting. His own vehicle he avoided completely. The Russian president waited in his car. Finally, Modi got into his car. They drove for 45 minutes back to the hotel. The actual content of the discussion was privy to nobody except the two of them. This is very unusual. And why at all such a thing would be done? It seemed to be almost impromptu. If at all it was arranged, it was back channel level arrangements. What did it represent? And when Modi came back to India a few days later, in a public program, when people were clapping, he said, I'd just been to China, etc. People clapping, he said, are you clapping because I went or because I came back alive? A very interesting statement. That tells you the nature of what's happening behind the scenes, of which the media will tell you nothing. What is important, they will cover up with distractions. What is unimportant, they will highlight to confuse. So in reality, I do not find in this kind of evidence, at least in the diplomacy space, US soft power diminishing at all. If anything, it is in the media that such an image is created when you see the interactions, even from NATO heads, what they have to say of the US under Trump compared to what they said of the US or did when under Biden or Obama, it's completely different. US power has enormously increased, both hard power as well as soft power. People are recognizing Trump's statements. He says what he thinks, he acts what he says, and he's serious. And so that really changes the whole nature of diplomacy globally. And it's disrupting because so far diplomacy was held behind the doors in a kind of a wishy-washy language. People were afraid to speak openly. In diplomatic language, you gave hints, you gave suggestions, and maybe they were accepted or not. Both parties were talking in a very complex language of respect and hints. Trump breaks all that, speaks blatantly, openly. But there's something we will see. We'll discuss that shortly. There's a huge operation taking place behind the scenes, of which you see the result when it happens. Till then, nothing nothing you see. So he's playing a very interesting game. And my view is actually US soft power has increased. There's a huge reversal of what US was before to what it is now. There's again a shift taking place financially, where US was sinking rapidly. It's been put on a hold, and a slow build-up has started, while Europe continues to sink, interestingly. And Europe has lost much of its soft power as well as hard power, and especially financial power. Um, yes, India's public relations and agreements are enormously better under Modi. For the same reason, Modi is actively engaging with all these local regions. Unlike US, which has a global play, India has more of a local play in terms of power politics globally with economic politics. So Modi has been very careful in his strategy. He's engaging across the world, even with small countries. But the foresight of what he's looking at is in terms of what resources India lacks, which they have strongly, and building cultural level and social level engagements with those governments for long-term partnership for India's long-term security in these raw materials and resources. And because he is operating in this way, many of these countries, for the first time, are actually heaving a sigh of relief, because now they can benefit at the same time as being beneficial. So this has changed India's place globally. It has made India today one of the most powerful in terms of influence, which is the reason why, as we saw before, also even for things such as Ukraine war, all sides were turning to India for making an intervention. So current trends are definitely showing a rise of Asia, which means not only India, but also China, both. And both are playing strong games. China, though, has a very different game. It is way ahead of India in terms of military power, economic power, and political clout. Way ahead. India is at best playing catch up. But still, the nature of the dynamics of the way both are playing power games are completely different. So I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit as we go along. I just have two comments from Narad. Narad's comment, just reading his text message. I've heard that the Russians knew there was to be an attempt on Modi's life, and they didn't let him get in the car, but guided him to Putin's car. Yes, that seems to have been the events that took place. Modi was actually told in some, again, these are not using conventional diplomacy, because all those might be compromised, but bypassing conventional diplomacy, he was asked to get into Putin's car. And also Narad says there's a lot on Obama's attempts to prevent Trump from becoming president and talk of his prosecution. Yes, quite a few interesting things are happening in the US, which we hear nothing about. For example, under Biden's presidentship, a lot of, I believe, nearly 45 to 50 executive orders were signed with Biden's signature. But if you hold all those executive order signatures next to each other, you clearly see they were not signed by an ink pen by human hand. They were what is called an auto pen. That's like a rubber stamp of the signature, which were stamped. And it turns out there was not one auto pen. So auto pens are used generally when the president is unable to sign for some reason, he's out and you need urgently to sign. So the auto pen is kept for those situations. It turns out there were, I believe, if I remember right, it was 5, maybe 4 to 5 auto pens held by different people in Biden's cabinet or his team, but using those signatures to sign executive orders that Biden knew nothing about. This is really, really serious. Imagine the US president as effectively the most powerful man in the world because of the control he has on the military and the economy and policies. And under his name, signatures are being imprinted on about 45 to 50 executive orders, and he does not even know about it. And he's not in a condition even to understand what he's doing. If you remember when he just won his presidentship, the very first day, under glare of media lights, he signed about 45 executive orders. And while signing the 10th, they were just placed in front of him and he signed. While signing the 10th, he mumbles under his breath loud enough that it was recorded, "I have no idea what I'm signing." And he went on signing all these. But much later, because as you see now today, it's become evident, which the media then was denying and covering up, he had severe dementia. And this was covered up at the time. Today, media heads are coming out saying, yeah, we covered up because, and they make up some reasons. But that's not acceptable. That means the media was lying to you at that time, denying that he had dementia. Turns out he has cancer, and the type of cancer he has was there at least for 2 years. So again, media lied, the health department of the presidency lied. Everybody was lying and covering up his actual condition. But most important, the autopen signatures. Under Trump now, there's a whole investigation happening on that. One of the things they are trying to do, they have passed one of the orders, I think it is still under Congress in requiring signatures, that all things signed under autopen that Biden was not aware of will be deemed as cancelled. This is huge. It's one of the biggest scams in US history. And there's absolutely nothing about it in the mainstream media discussions. And that tells you how much the media is lying to you or covering up in this case. So I'll come to Narad also said, please comment about ICE, that is the immigration controls. I'll come to that shortly after reading Sumana's question. So just to close Maya's question without going further into this, we'll take up those issues later. Without going further into this, broadly, we see the trend of the rise of Asia, which was Sri Aurobindo's general description of those 5 dreams. And we're seeing it in a huge way. When I described what's happening with China, it will be astounding. And it seems to be inevitable. India is way behind even in that respect. Yet India is playing a very strong leadership game here. So ability of dragon and elephant to tango, yes, I think more and more it will be as if India plays its card right. I'm still putting an if because Modi has only begun the process. It would need another 20 years to complete it. If it continues on the same track, then India and China effectively between the two would make a huge difference in global affairs on many levels, including even economic. India has moved right now to 4th position of an economic power globally from what used to be something like 10th position before. And I remember at that time we had all these statements which would say, oh, India will barely reach 4th or 5th position after another 30 years in 2040, 2050 at the current rate of growth. Everything has changed. Everything has changed with a rapidity that is astounding. And India is moving to 3rd position very soon, economically. And remember, all these positions are not real. They are all based on currency fluctuation values. If tomorrow the dollar collapses, India might just be thrown to 2nd position overnight. So it's not about that. It's about the effective power that India holds more than anything else. So I'm going to go to Sumana's question, which has some observations as well as a question. She says, in some of the recent sessions you mentioned, you're going to speak of current affairs soon. I'd like to share some of my thoughts and some questions for which I'm trying to find answers. So among first her thoughts, looking back when Trump took charge, it appears things started to move in the right direction. The distinct positives which are visible immediately were crackdown on funds which were used to engineer regime change across the world. So we've spoken of that, but that's huge already. Imagine all the funding that was going from US State Department or the CIA to fund terrorism and regime change across the world. Suddenly all those have dried out. That makes a very big difference already for global peace. Second, crackdown on malpractices of the pharmaceutical industries, especially around COVID vaccines. Yes, not just COVID vaccines. There have been a huge set of shifts in the government directives on what can and cannot be used in medicines, as well as opening up new opportunities for existing drugs to be repurposed and removal of poisons in the foods. This is one of the biggest shifts. One sample of that, which I'll refer to later again, is Coca-Cola suddenly removing high fructose syrup from its Coke and inserting cane sugar. Why is this a big deal? Because high fructose syrup is known to create all those poisonous side effects, including mood swings, and even has been linked to cancer in certain studies. And everywhere else in the world, and even in Europe, they were not using high fructose syrup. They were using cane sugar. Why only in the US they use the worst poisons, which are banned in Europe, so there they don't use it, and then you're using it in the US. It's as if the company says, we don't care what happens to people as long as we make a profit. We don't care if people die or get sick or have cancer or whatever else. And there are certain colorings which are known to create irritation and cancer. There's a particular red coloring extracted from a bug, which is used openly in the US by all the food manufacturers, banned in Europe. And so not used there by the same manufacturers. Same brand, same name, same product, looks the same, but the ingredients are totally different because Europe banned it. US did not ban it, so you poisoned the US people. So under Trump, this has changed. And how we're going to discuss a little bit about that later. So there are actually bigger issues, not just around the vaccines. Third, she says, crack down on the woke culture and associated social disturbances through the LGBTQ movement, etc. So I was recalled seeing a social media post by an Indian mother who actually says she has two daughters living in the US. One of those daughters identifies as a man, etc. She's very proud of the whole thing. And then she says, both my daughters have a job in the US and they are professional. What's the term used when they go on these demonstrations? I'll just use the word demonstrator. They're professional demonstrators. What does that mean? That means they're hired to stand among these large crowds which come and demonstrate for whatever the cause. They actually don't care what the cause is. They're part of that left-funded economy where there are people, protesters, that's what they say, where they have official teams of protesters who are paid only to protest, and that's their primary job. They move all over the place. They are provided funds, food, etc., and they go and protest whatever the cause is which the left is currently supporting then. And they're professional protesters. She proudly says that. And that's the job. Can you imagine what that means? And I had given a link, I think, in our last discussion of a company which is organizing protests, and they can do any protest for you if you pay them the right amount. And they've been approached, they've been offered some $10-20 million to protest against Trump, etc. All the recent protests you saw, many of these are organized in this nature and across the world, and not just in the US. And that's the funding which USAID was providing, which Trump cut. So protests in India have also dramatically dropped, except where they're now funded primarily from local funds and the regime change attempts which come with that. So yes, that's a much bigger thing. The protest funding itself goes along with the woke culture and associated things. Fourth, she says crackdown on illegal immigration. This is one of the biggest shifts that has taken place on a scale that we have never seen before. Remember, under Biden's 4-year presidency, about 12 million people came in illegally. Now, what's the problem? When you see the media reports, they will all say America is a country of immigrants. Yes, legal immigrants. What's the problem with illegal immigrants? Well, give them a chance. No, it's not that. The problem was the bulk of the illegal immigrants were rejects from other countries, from Central America, South America, and many of them were actually from cartels and gangs. Many of them were criminals. Many of them were sent by other countries to sow discord, confusion in the US. Among them, yes, there might be some who are coming purely for economic opportunities. But to them, I would ask the question, why don't you go through the legal route? Well, because they would not qualify under current legal requirements. So the question really comes to, as a country, is it the US job to provide job opportunities when existing US citizens don't have the same job opportunities? And these are questions which then go into a direction that the mainstream media does not touch. For example, we see in New York State that they were offering illegal immigrants credit cards in which $2,000 had been put, they could use for anything. Hotels in New York City were hired by the government to host illegal immigrants who had just come in with no background checks. And the result practically was that if you went to the city, you did not find hotels. And if you went to those hotels, they were full of these illegal immigrants living in a completely elite lifestyle paid for by taxes that the US citizens, in this case, New Yorkers, were paying for. And you have to really ask, where is this going? Why was this useful? Because using those illegal immigrants, you could swing elections. because the US is the most backward country as far as it comes to election security. So in the US, you could walk into an election booth and claim to be any name. As long as the name exists in the voter rolls, you can give your vote, and there's no verification. So there were large numbers, in the millions, of dead people who were still on the rolls, some of them going back who had died 50 years ago. Many who had shifted houses, so they were voting in two places, and they were officially legally voting one place. Somewhere else, somebody else was voting on their behalf. And interestingly, in some states, and it varies state-wise, it's not even a centrally controlled thing. Some states, as long as you could show a driving ID, driving license, you could vote, even if your name was not on the list. So the result was, when driving license anybody can get without being a citizen. So the result was all these illegal immigrants were getting driving licenses, getting jobs sometimes in some of these sanctuary cities, and then they would go and vote. Of course, for those who gave them the jobs and the opportunities. So it's one of those very strange things which happened in the New York elections recently, where Mamdani was elected as the mayor of New York. And if you saw the polls of New Yorkers proper, you would get the impression that there's no way this man can win. If you went to the official polls, which included immigrants, including illegal immigrants, then there was a strong swing towards Mamdani. And you have to really ask what happened at that point. And I wouldn't go into that discussion right now. That's going to be too big away from our main theme. So yes, there's a huge shift that Trump brought about to have illegal immigrants voluntarily go back. They created an app, people could sign up, and many of them, they were offered $2,000 to leave on their own. And that worked quite well. But most important, what he did was also to stop people who were coming legally, but then using the US platform using their visas as tourists or educational visas to interfere in US politics. So you had all these students in many of the elite Harvard and other colleges and universities across the country who were protesting for Palestine, against Israel, or against Trump, or for whoever. Now, this is that protest culture which was funded by the leftists, students doing that. And sometimes they would go on strike to shut down the entire campus. And you have to ask, what did you come for? Your visa was for education, not for interfering in the local politics. You have very strict laws where if you, for example, you are giving donations in the US, then the donations get tax breaks only if they do not fund political views or political demonstrations. For that, you have special PACs and other systems. But here were students coming in the millions doing protests on a visa which was for education. And well, what are they doing in terms of education? Well, except for the technical education, in all the arts and social sciences education, as they call it, it's not really science, it's social studies. They were all involved in all these kinds of protests. So you had to ask yourself, is this acceptable? And so one of the things Trump did was they canceled the visas for many of these students who were in the most vocal and the most damaging in terms of the violence that they represented. Many of them broke things, burned things, etc. So that's part of the immigration controls. Immediately, all of those protests died down. Funding was cut. Again, protests died down further, and so on. Mainstream media generally spun it around, saying Trump is against Harvard, he's against higher education. No, he was against using those campuses for political interventions. And that was never clear in the mainstream media reports. And so I'm coming back to Sumana's list. She has got also crackdown on Islamic fundamentalism. And that's a very big shift. As I pointed out earlier in many, many sessions ago, that the biggest shift that took place when in the previous presidency of Trump was the relationship he set up with Saudi Arabia, where the entire primary funding for Islamic fundamentalism globally was cut. And the new person who took over, Mohammed bin Salman, is against fundamentalism. He is for a moderate Islam and genuine Islam, etc. So many things have happened. I'm not going into details about that now because we've talked about it. So I'm coming to Sumana's letter. All of these movements left positive impressions in Bharat. Bharat is the way India calls itself. So read as India if you don't understand the term. And we started to see reform in different spheres, all of which felt like an overall positive. Now comes the negative, she says. However, in the recent past, things started to move in a different direction. Trump started to take sides with Islamic nations, make compromises. His recent actions with regard to Pakistan during and after Operation Sindoor, his meeting, shaking hands with ex-terrorists turned new leaders in Syria are some of the examples. Does this mean he and his administration are now overpowered by Assyric forces? On a separate observation, I saw that a few months back, US moved off the WHO and stopped its funding, which was a great move. WHO, remember, World Health Organization, is a global institution, but it has no official sanction. It's actually a private institution, primarily funded by Bill Gates, George Soros, and the like for other agendas. And if I remember right, they're not also technically under the UN, but they are asserting themselves as if a global health institution that countries have to accept. So US cut the funding on WHO. I spoke about the reasons earlier. US was given the largest amount of money. China was giving like 10% of it, but China was dictating the terms of WHO policies. US policies were ignored, and the funding was used for other reasons. So Sumana continues. However, we saw that other nations, including Bharat, India, signed the draconian pandemic treaty. I was baffled to see the compulsion Bharat still has to sacrifice sovereignty in this way. I'm wondering what needs to be done to overcome this compulsion. So I'll just answer this very quickly. Yes, there is this pandemic treaty, which is like a global treaty WHO is imposing on, if I remember right, 149 countries, that if at all there's a pandemic tomorrow, suddenly WHO would have control over what happens in all these countries, effectively becoming a super country, like a super bureaucracy, which will impose its terms and the countries have to follow them. That's the picture we are being given of the pandemic treaty. If you go deeper, though, you will see the pandemic treaty is a cluster of treaties. And the primary framework which India has signed, which US did not sign, by the way, though it was involved in the negotiations and has still not signed, the primary framework which was signed is one for sharing of information, sharing of medical data, and commitments from companies receiving the medical data to provide in return a certain percentage of vaccines or other medicines to WHO for global use. So on that level, if you stop with that, there is no major disadvantage and there might be some minor advantages. And so what India signed so far is only that much, as far as I understand. Maybe I'm wrong, but all my research led me to this much. There are other facets to further treaties which would involve ceding sovereignty and control. As far as I'm aware, India has not signed that, and that has not yet been officially, let's say, imposed on everybody yet. So this is where I am in my understanding. Maybe I'm wrong, but this is how I understood. So as far as I know, there's nothing to concern about too much. Hopefully, we will never get to a signature which involves that kind of ceding of sovereignty. I continue with Sumana's note, which is very important, her observation. Another unanswered question I have is regarding China. China, its current form is imperialist. It is keen to occupy other countries, including Bharat, India, and compromise their sovereignty. Hence, I do not see a rising China as good for the world. In some of the recent talks, you mentioned Mark's vision, where Mark mentioned the future China is going to be the economic hub of the world, while India will be the spiritual hub. This felt uncomfortable to me. Does this mean that the nature of China's policy will change drastically so that it won't be a threat to the world any longer? Did Mark say anything about Bharat's economic prosperity? The views shared by our Indian seers refer to a prosperous Bharat in every sphere, including economy. So recent developments in Bharat also point to this direction. And then she ends, sorry for the long message. Would you please share your views and shed some light? Yes, so I'll comment about China and India also in this regard, because there are several interesting things to see in terms of trend lines. But first, I'm going to look at the big picture of the global disruption that has happened, primarily after Trump winning. Even before he had won in his prior presidency, a lot of things had shifted majorly. But what you see now is major disruption, primarily because of the trade negotiations and tariffs. And suddenly, existing set relationships and stabilities of tariff, global production, global economies have been upended, disrupted, changed, a lot of uncertainties. And At first, it might seem dangerous, but once we understand the big picture, you will see why it's a very important move and perhaps even in the long run, a very positive shift. But first, you must recognize that you don't have to like Trump. Understand what he's doing, why he's doing, the way it's working, and his style of operation. This is what I want to discuss first. The big picture, really. For this, we have to understand what happened in the last 50 years in the US economy. Something very serious took place at some point where originally, at the end of the Second World War, the US became a global economic power because for the war reparations and the war funding and reconstruction, all the European countries basically transferred their gold to the US to pay for it. Gold was the standard at that point. In return, the US gave them dollars, and there was a certain peg of a relationship. I think it was $35 to an ounce or something like that, which was set. Eventually, the US started printing money, and it shifted from $35 to $42 to an ounce, etc. At some point in 1973 or so, I think it's called the Bretton Woods Agreement, the US decided to abandon the gold reference completely and started printing dollars in cash. That's around the time when you see suddenly the Middle East coming into great power because of oil, and we have the oil boom. And based on that, the Middle East had more dollars, which the US was printing basically, and the US was buying oil from them. Although US had its own oil supplies, which at that time I saw a very strategic move. They said, when the Middle East oil dries up, we will take up our own resources. At that time, the world will depend on the US. In a way, that did happen, except Middle East oil never dried up. That's another story I've referred to before. It's not going to dry up so soon because oil is continuously renewed. And we have discussed that. I won't come back to it. It's actually bacteria which grow, which make for the oil. And it's one of those great secrets that the science and the media will not tell you for economic reasons. So what happened at that point was, subsequently, the US was printing money, buying things from the world, and its manufacture was still globally dominant. Except gradually it started shifting high technology to Japan at first, then Korea. And at some point, Japan had so much surplus US dollar because they were manufacturing all the advanced technology, Sony, Panasonic, Hitachi, these were the big companies, that so much money, they didn't know what to do with it. So what did they do? They were encouraged by the US government to invest that money back in the US. So they bought up all these media companies like all the big names of what were at that time big companies, cinema production, television production. They what is, just look at it objectively, what happened. US printed cash, bought goods from Japan. Japan had cash, didn't know what to do with it, gave it back to the US. To buy what? Ownership, which means what? Well, still US controls the content. They just gave you back the cash, which was one of the most brilliant deals for the US. Except technology was in Japanese hands. China saw this strategy. And China began then to deliberately structure itself to become the next Japan, but 1,000 times bigger. That is, it would take all manufacturing from the US, produce everything and the most advanced technologies eventually in China. US would have nothing left except printing cash, which is what happened subsequently. From the 90s, let's say, China took over globally all of the production. And how did they do it? By massive subsidies. One of the biggest subsidies was free land. If in India you want to set up a company, a huge part of the cost is the land that you have to buy and the infrastructure you build. China gave you free land. And if you were a US company coming into China, they gave you free land and they gave you free infrastructure resources so that you could set up the most advanced technology, but under one condition. The Chinese would be a part of your core team. You had to hire Chinese people and you had to make sure the most advanced core technology was accessible by Chinese government, just to make sure national interest is not compromised. Effectively, over a period of about 30 years, China became the world's producer for everything. And I remember seeing this under Manmohan Singh. Again, the same drama was happening in India. They were basically paying political parties. China was paying political parties to make this transfer. Make your policies such that you told everybody, hey, you will get it cheaper if you manufacture in China and then import into India, for example. And every country was being made to do this. And I remember at that time, India shifted its entire tiles production to China. And I said, what advanced technology does it give you? What is China providing that you can't do locally? The only difference was price. And imagine you're shifting production to China. They make the tiles, you ship it across by ship to India, and it's still cheaper than producing locally. How do you explain this? You cannot explain this. How do you explain that apples grown in Australia, brought by ship to India, going through 3 levels of transfer, each one taking their cut, reach you and are cheaper than local apples produced in India? How do you explain this? The game is very simple. The game is rigged to help others and to not help your own people. This was the big problem Trump is facing in China, in USA, in relation to China, and India was facing in relation to China and everyone else. And here's the interesting part. I'm coming to India specifically. Indian apples, to ship them from Himachal Pradesh, where they're grown, to, let's say, Pondicherry, was more expensive than to ship them from Australia to Pondicherry. Can you believe that? Why? Because India had the most convoluted interstate laws and rules, and the commissions you had to pay all the way down. Modi changed all that with the national VAT system, which made a common, let's say, platform that allowed you to ship things around in India relatively freely, with a consistent structure that then suddenly created a huge boost in the economy, despite whatever inconveniences you might have had. I would still say get rid of all income tax even. And well, it's a bigger story. I'm not going to get into that. But India has still a lot of way to go to simplify further the bureaucracy. But already with the VAT, things became even, and that changed the pricing structure. Still, why is the apple from Australia or the tiles produced in China cheaper? Because there are massive subsidies there. While the same World Bank and other organizations were squeezing India to not give subsidies to farmers. Other countries were doing that and then giving you cheaper goods. And China, obviously, primarily through land, through loans, through other mechanisms, were subsidizing all production. The result effectively was India was heading the same path, producing nothing, and we had huge balance of payments issues with China. But I'm coming to the US, which is bigger. In the US, 99% of all purchases were coming from China, some from other countries, and US was producing less than 1%. So what was US doing? Because you have to have an exchange of equitable resources, it was printing paper money. And so US economy was booming. They just had to print more paper and suddenly they were more wealthy, but still a problem. Why doesn't every country do that? Because the moment you print money, you have inflation. How does US ensure it does not have inflation? And the trick they played was they controlled through military power and through economic and other influences, they made every country start accumulating the printed cash. So India had to, for example, in those days, keep up to prevent a balance of payment crisis, to prevent the rupee from collapsing, you had to accumulate US dollars to back the rupee. And the numbers kept increasing. As much as the US printed, the more you had to accumulate. So, for example, at one point, I remember India had $150 billion in reserves, and it was considered very strong. Today, India has some $600 billion or $500 billion. Somehow the numbers don't matter even. They're such high numbers. Just to prevent a rupee not crashing. Who would crash the rupee if you didn't have that number? Well, that was the control the US had, because it controlled the financial systems which basically declared the rupee strong or weak. So the reference that they gave, unfortunately, I'm not good with this, the terms they use. For suppose on the rupee, they will say the rupee is very high value credit AAA, and then you can borrow money at lower rates. If they drop your credit rating, then you have to pay more money to borrow. That is, you pay higher interest to borrow money. Hang on. From whom do you borrow money? From the international institutions in what? US dollars. How do you pay back? In US dollars. And what's that coming from? Printed cash. So they ensured all transactions, and especially all transactions in oil, had to be in US dollars. Now, as long as you need oil, you need to have US dollars. If you borrow money and pay back, you have to pay in US dollars. So what happened at that point was there was so much cash India had to accumulate, all other countries. that US could keep printing. I give an example what happened under Manmohan Singh when he was finance minister. I believe it was 92, 93 in that period, 1992, 93. The Indian rupee was about 8 rupees to a dollar. Overnight, Manmohan Singh made it 20 rupees to a dollar. And then a few weeks later, he made it 40 rupees to a dollar. What happened at that point? Indian rupee collapsed 5 times lower its value in relation to US dollar. Practically, what did it mean? It meant if you had to pay back $1 of the loan you had taken from the US indirectly through whatever agency, you had to now pay 5 times more back with interest. So suddenly the worth of an Indian worker vis-a-vis the US worker was 5 times less. You had to sweat out 5 times more effort to compare to the same value of worth of work. Now, who does this benefit? We were told, and because of the control they had on the media, they were glibly lying to you like crazy, saying, this is good for India, you can export more. What does it mean? You will export 5 times more goods for the same dollar that you get. Does that make sense to you? You'll actually have to export 5 times more material to get the same dollar. Doesn't make sense. And I remember at that point, 1996 or so, US ambassador making a statement which was promoted in the media in a big way. We have finally agreed to allow India to export mangoes to the US. It'll be good for the Indian economy. Haha. What a great service was done. Except that the best mangoes now went at 1/5 the price to the US, and Indians had no mangoes left. All the worst ones were left for India. And the ones who were exporting got the dollar. So they became relatively wealthier, 5 times wealthier than the others who had to sweat out 5 times more to get to the same wealth level. So it created massive inequalities, triggered massive inflation in India. And then to maintain that reference, today is, of course, the dollar has gone to nearly 86, 90 to a rupee. To maintain that reference, to be able to maintain the export-based economy, you had to keep the rupee weak. So effectively, subsequently, it was justified to be export compatible, to be able to be advantageous in your export, keep the rupee weak, except you are an enslaved country which has to work extra hard to pay back the loans. When the BJP came to power, at that time it was the first BJP Prime Minister, forget his name. He actually started a reversal of this. He said, no more loans. India will pay back quickly as possible, and closed all its loans to international entities. And for the first time, India started lending money to smaller countries using the same trick. And rapidly, India gained strength and the rupee started strengthening against the dollar. The Manmohan Singh government came and again they reversed all the policies, put India under debt and weakened the rupee further. Now what happens is, once you've set this up, remember all Indian manufacturing was designed for export at that point. To make money, you export. You don't think of domestic consumption. Modi reversed this thinking and said, make in India and for India. This reversal still did not say stop exporting. He said, yes, please export, but make in India. Don't import anymore. One major reversal. But at what stage will you say, hey, export is not your way. It's always keeping you unbalanced and weak. The problem still existed. The US was printing cash. So 30, 40, 50 years down, it's still printing cash. So what is the US doing to reverse? Forcing other countries to hold cash. The second thing the US did, which was very interesting, ensured that you needed the cash to buy oil. Third thing they did was, you spent the cash to buy military weapons. And US became the world's largest producer of most advanced military weapons. So for example, for about 10 years, Iran and Iraq were fighting with bombs, with missiles, with planes, all bought from the US by both countries equally. So you were producing oil, buying advanced weapons, killing each other, buying more advanced weapons, killing each other. As long as you were selling oil in US dollars, it was fine. War became one of the most important requirements to burn up the dollars, because to buy a single missile, you pay so many millions. The actual cost is far less. But because it's a monopoly for advanced missiles, you can put any price, and for a little piece of hardware, you spend the equivalent of millions or billions of man hours of human labor, and the US dollars go back to the countries. Like Japan was conned into buying, basically owning US companies to put the cash back. India was forced to buy. Now, at that point, India was still tied to Russia, and most of its weapons were coming from Russia, which worked fine for Russia. India had a rupee ruble agreement with Russia, which worked wonderfully well for Russians as well as for the Indians who were trading with Russia, that you could buy at Indian rupee, convert to ruble, and sell in dollar, and you would make in the circle, you would make huge amounts of money because all the exchange rates were controlled except the Indian rupee to US dollar. So it worked wonderfully well for Russia. Russia made a lot of money. India benefited by getting cheaper weapons. But the problem still was, to use up the cash, US needed wars. This was the basis for the great wars that took place, particularly under Bush. And Bush at one point makes a public statement about this, that wars are the best business. Because there you consume everything, all this excess dollar which is being used up gets consumed. And the result is it can keep running the war machine, which is run from the excess dollars printed. Now, how long will this continue? The same story continued under Obama. You can't stop the wars, because the moment you stop the wars, or you can't stop people, you have to force them to buy oil with US dollars. The moment these two shift, wars stop, or you stop buying oil with US dollars, the US dollar economy will crash. So it's unsustainable for the world. It's not good for the US because US is doing practically nothing. You have huge poverty in the US. Nobody talks about this because there are no jobs. All the jobs went to China. All the production went to China. And so at some point, US is actually, a large part of population is living homeless or on stamps. And nobody talks about this. You're only shown examples of Bill Gates made so much money. And Indians who went under H-1B visa and made so much money. But they were all on the upper crust of the economy, technology economy. You go down and you find people are struggling to get jobs. Why? Because it all went to China. So in the first presidency of Trump, he reversed this. He brought back manufacturing in the US in a very big way. I gave examples of this in earlier discussions. I won't repeat. But something had to be still done to change this vicious cycle where US is printing money and needs wars to stay alive. China, meanwhile, had the same problem or benefit that Japan had initially. They had huge amounts of US cash. They kept the China yuan at a connected relationship with the dollar, which is fixed currency. Remember, India was told by World Bank and others, you must leave your rupee floating, let the market forces decide. China didn't do that. China said, we define the yuan in terms of the rupee by whatever fixed proportion, and it stayed fixed for decades to ensure China was competitive against all other countries to be manufacturers for the world. The best technology comes, all the workers are there, China gets all of the jobs of the world, but what's it doing with all the cash? So here's the game. If tomorrow the US dollar was to shut down, China would be left holding paper. What did they do? They invested it in Africa and across the world, in Europe, in the US, in India. So first of all, in Africa, they bought up all the mines. They bought up all the food products. And this is the basis on which today China controls the world's rare earth minerals. They control them because they use the US dollar to buy up all this. They bought the mines long term. They own them for life, for eternity, effectively, unless some major shift takes place. And then they ensured the government will not change, they cannot fall, by putting their own military inside there to help and support the government dictators. So Africa is effectively owned by China in large parts where the minerals are involved. Then they bought up politicians across the world, including in Europe, including in US, including in India. And by buying up, they twisted policies to serve Chinese interests long term. So effectively, China became a global giant economically, but with huge political clout, and they played a very careful game by working behind the scenes. They always seem to be, hey, we're the best manufacturers, lowest price. That's all. But what they did behind the scenes, nobody knew. There are very interesting statements by which are not translated into English, by Chinese professors who are saying how 40 years back, 40 years back, they understood that money controls US economy. If you buy up Wall Street, you control the US politicians. Same game they played in Europe. So you go to Europe, for France, for example, Napoleon is one of the great figures. So there's this whole palace, castle, which is Napoleon's castle. He stayed there. He used to come there and is the focal point from where he gave orders, controlled things. And today, if you go as a tourist, in the middle of the castle is a Chinese museum of Chinese culture. From the Chinese point of view, they just did a huge scoop. They inserted Chinese culture as superior to French culture in the middle of the French icon of French authority and strength and history. They inserted China Museum of Chinese culture. So they played a very powerful soft power game across the world. And they had their students, they had this plan long term to insert students across the world, and especially in the US, to access highest technologies, highest advanced mathematics, technological research, etc., and then bring it back to China to strengthen Chinese national interest. And of course, with strong national identity, strong sense of identity, this worked wonderfully. In India, it was the reverse. You had people leaving India to make money for yourself, never interested in India. This changed recently, barely in the last 10 years. Many are returning, but not because the government did anything to help. They come back and they're disappointed. They leave to go back to the US. The government does nothing to help or support internal development of Indians trained in the US or elsewhere. So, big difference in the approach of China and India, long-term thinking under in the Chinese strategy. So now I'm coming back to the big picture. How does the US change the game? You bring back manufacturing in the US, stop printing paper money, and don't need to have wars anymore to keep the US economy alive. Trump wants to end wars. He wants to bring back manufacturing. But if today you suddenly announce, hey, we're going to stop all this, you can do nothing. The manufacturing is in Chinese hands. To bring it back and rebuild is a 10-year, 20-year affair at least. So first presidency, Trump started that. Lost 4 years under Biden, but the momentum continued on one level because it takes time to set up industries and trigger. Now comes Trump's second presidency. So you get 12 years about. Under that period, this shift has started, but it's not enough. It's going to take time. How do you bring back jobs? So obviously H-1B visas were controlled, were made available initially because they needed high talents. India gave that, China gave that. But at some point it was misused. They replaced US workers by cheaper Indian workers, which was good for India, bad for the US. Trump has reversed that. He put a stop on the H-1B and ensured it's only used for the object for which it was, which is high value individuals that you cannot find in the US. Now, it's no big deal. Every country does that. If you go to Switzerland, for example, there's a law that says if you want to hire anybody, first find a local fellow who can do that. If you cannot find a local fellow, then you go to the next regional fellow. If you cannot find that, then you look for it in Europe. If you cannot find that, then you hire from another country. You have to go through all those steps to protect what? Local workers. And when the US does that and says, hey, we need to protect American workers, then you see the drama that the media makes. As if Trump has committed a great crime. No, he's only protecting the US interest the way every country protects its own interests. Would you, for example, be acceptable to looking at India if suddenly the government changed a policy and allowed cheap Bangladeshi workers to come in and take up your jobs because they're cheaper? It's happening right now, but they're coming as illegal immigrants across the country. All the grassroots level workers, constructors, builders, the workers who are working with the bricks and cement are mostly Bangladeshi workers. But if you started doing that officially, then you would probably get your government pulled down. Trump is doing something good for the US. It's not something against India. So understand where he's going to is to bring back manufacturing, bring back workers, bring back the US independence of manufacture, and slowly cut down this tap of paper printing. And come back to a standard which is stable, which would be a gold standard eventually, or whatever the new reference might be in the global economy. And this would allow the US to still remain strong and powerful, but not require wars to remain strong and powerful. This is the big shift. And a part of that is also reducing China's hold that it has on the whole world by bringing back manufacturing. So there's a massive shift that has taken place with regard to China. I'm going to just elaborate on this very quickly. I'm trying to get through a lot of things rapidly, so don't mind if I'm speaking fast, but you'll get the idea. So one of the best ways to do this was to put tariffs. In fact, if you go back to US history, before income tax was inserted in the US history, it was through tariffs that the government earned money and there was no income tax. So you could do anything you want, earn all the money, it's yours. You don't have to pay tax to the government. The tax came from things which were imported at the tariff entry point, which made a lot of sense. It worked well. And this is what Trump is indirectly doing. He's putting massive tariffs, forcing the same companies to produce in the US, but it'll be cheaper without the tariffs, and re-triggering local manufacture where local prices are higher because the cost of a human being working in the US is higher than a human being working in China or in India. Remember, because of the dollar rupee exchange rate, a worker in China is 1/5 the value. Sorry, a worker in India is 1/5 of the value of a worker in the US for the same work, for the same competence. You correct that by putting, for example, 5x tariff. Okay, it's not 5x tariff because there's a price and the worker cost is a small part of the price. You make a 5x on the worker cost. That's how you'll balance the two. So now nobody thinks like that in that detail. There's a general tariff because it's too complicated to do that for every good. There's a general tariff which encourages the same Indian company to manufacture in the US if they want the products to be sold in the US rather than exporting from India, where the Indian worker would benefit. There is the US worker who benefits. So understand the rationale for what Trump is doing, rebuilding local economy, local production, and it's a long-term strategy. But more important behind that is ending this whole drama of paper money and the requirement for wars to keep the paper money alive. And this is the big picture Trump is working for the world. So there's a US agenda, which is bring back economy, production, workers, jobs. And there's a global agenda, end wars, and the economic structure which promotes wars, and indirectly also weaken the hold that China has on the world. So we're going to look a little bit at China. What happened at that point when China took over? China kept the currency controlled. It also shifted all the advanced technology and all the advanced research to China. Today, practically every major research breakthrough has one of the top 3 persons who is a Chinese, either living in the US or living in China. And that's the kind of shift that China has managed to do in 30 years. It's a big change. India is nowhere near in this matter still. Though we're moving fast, but not yet anywhere near. As a result of the excess USD dollars that China had, it bought up all the rare earth materials, which control all the high-tech magnets, without which you cannot have any of the advanced military technology. You cannot have any advanced motors for civilian technology, including for pumps and refrigerators and any other miniaturized motors. It controls advanced rare earth materials for batteries. So effectively, it controls all the battery. Today, there's nothing which is not without battery eventually. And then all the high-tech chip raw materials also that they control. And this is going to a domain which is outside silicon, very high specialized materials, which also China largely controls because they control the mines. Second thing, which what China did was they controlled the technology leadership in the world, nearly. They inserted in all their products which they were manufacturing, including motherboards and other chips, spyware, which went back to the US and became spyware inside Apple's data centers. And China could access the data centers until the US found out under Trump and reversed that process. Then the most advanced military technology, China has nearly caught up. Hypersonic missiles, advanced stealth craft, etc. Which, how did China get there so quickly? Because they spied on the US technologies. They paid money to companies and to individuals and companies to transfer the technology. Under Trump, this got exposed. Under Obama, nothing was happening. Under Obama, something very weird took place. I give this as an example. Two examples I'll give. So under Obama, there was a US military craft that was spy craft, one of the most advanced technologically spy craft, flying just outside Chinese domestic waters in international waters. And suddenly it has a technical fault. It turns into China instead of going to Japan. It turns in where there is military base. It goes into China and lands in a Chinese military base. And as it turns out, the craft has not only the most advanced technologies spying, but also all the manuals of the US military for communications. And nobody does that in a spy craft, first of all. And suddenly all the manuals are there. All of this was seized by China. And after a lot of negotiations, the US military individuals, human beings were returned to the US. Aircraft and manuals and technology, everything was kept by China for reverse engineering and for spying now on US protocols of military communications for which they had all the manuals available. This does not happen by chance. Something took place at a very high level inside the military to basically hand over to China whatever was needed in exchange for some favors. We don't know who, where, and there's no point speculating. Similar something took place in Iran. US had one of the most advanced spy drones, and Iran acquired or was given secretly the method by which they could hack the drone using GPS positioning data. They controlled the drone to make it seem like it was flying high by changing the GPS data until the drone was brought down to ground level and made to land without crashing. And they seized it. And that became the basis for Iran's modern, most advanced stealth drones, etc. Basic handover of technology was done. Similar things were happening with Pakistan. Pakistan's AQ Khan, head of the whole uranium and atomic technology, was trained in Europe, went back with all the data, then continued to have spy connections by which they were transferring data, etc. So this is a game that China's really developed well, how to pay whom in the right levels to extract all the most advanced technologies. So the most advanced tech products, the most advanced military, they're on the cutting edge, they're not yet there, but very close to the US. Space technology, China is rapidly caught up with the US almost. Again, if not for Elon Musk, they would be ahead of the US. It's only Elon Musk who has put it ahead of China. Who rules space rules the world. This is the reality today. You can eliminate any satellite. You can have communications through space. You can have weapons based in space, which can come on land within minutes, seconds, that you can not protect from. Effectively, it comes to the reality, whoever rules space rules the world in terms of military. China is very close to that, nearly. And the interesting part with all this, China ensured from the beginning it never allowed US social media to enter China. For all the things you have of addiction in India, for example, all the social media controlled from the US, a lot of it made by Indians who worked in Silicon Valley, but still, you are under US government control. You go to China, you will get none of the social media. They're all blocked. Chinese government created its own social media to keep its people hypnotized by its controls. Reasonable, very smart. And today, there's a panic in India. People are speaking of what if US cuts off social media to India? Well, we should have our own social media, etc. China was way ahead in the thinking in terms of controlling its citizens and providing them isolation from Western controls. Why is this important? Notice also, one of the biggest influencers of social media was TikTok, which was a Chinese company owned by Chinese government, effectively Chinese military, controlling the world. But they didn't allow US government to get in. How is this working? Because from the beginning, all social media has been under military control, directly or indirectly, or let's say deep state cabal controls. I remember when one day suddenly Google announced that they were making maps free. Google Maps is something everybody uses. They were making maps free. I asked myself, how did they get the data to have all the maps of all the worlds, of all the countries, and every road in the world suddenly overnight? Oh, they just made a deal with the US military that the US military spying system of the world would provide access to their military maps to Google for making their Maps app. In return for what? All the data on all of you, whatever you're tagging on your map and whatever you're doing is going back to US military, who holds the whole data behind the scenes. So effectively, all social media is under control of the military in some form or other, or under cabal control. China ensured they had their own cabal-controlled social media. So all of this basically put China in long-term thinking well ahead of the world. And to come to Sumana's concern, hesitation about China being dominant, yes, the problem is only because the Chinese Communist Party has global domination objectives. If this could change, the same strength of China could also, for example, be turned into something more friendly to the world. And this whole mentality of war and global domination need not be. How do we know they have it? Just look at the current foreign policies of China. They will fund Pakistan and give them weapons against India only because that's one way to keep India weak and on the edge. The policies of 1,000 cuts. On the frontier, they'll keep having skirmishes as a strategy, as a policy. Now, this does not come from goodwill, it comes from ill will. It comes from wanting to keep others dominated, suppressed, weak, etc. India doesn't do that. India is always trying to be helpful and friendly. So the strategic approach of diplomacy of both is fundamentally different. And it's the Communist Party with the communist ideology, which is built on global domination, which is the warp, the twist in the whole Chinese strength military. I would say if at some point this can be changed, and it's possible, I believe there's an attempt to do this. Trump is trying to work upon this, perhaps with Xi or with others. If this can be changed, then there can be a global partnership between powerful nations to assist each other rather than work against each other for global domination, to assist each other as one humanity with so many different facets, etc. I believe this can happen. I don't see yet the signs that it's happening in China, but I believe something is being attempted there. Finally, I come to the Chinese military. Today, is producing the world's largest aircraft carriers, where US is not producing anything anymore. Europe is not producing anything anymore. India has to buy from others, cannot yet produce its own aircraft carriers. China is producing them. They started by buying a defunct US aircraft carrier, which was being sold. They promised them it will not be used for the military. It's only to make a museum. They actually repurposed it, reverse engineered it, and made multiple aircraft carriers using that as the first one that they launched. So again, it's blatant lying in terms of agreements also, but for global objectives. Why does a country need aircraft carriers? Only when it needs to project strength at a distance away from its landmass. India needs one because Indian Ocean has many islands which are owned by India. But it never puts its aircraft carriers, let's say, in the Pacific Ocean or in the Atlantic Ocean because there's no interest in global domination. Chinese aircraft carriers are going all over the world. Chinese submarines, which are the most advanced, going across all over the world, near to the US coast. Why would they want to do that? Going to the Atlantic coast, European coast. Why? Because there is a global domination in the thinking. And that, unfortunately, if it does not change, you have a problem. China has the most advanced hypersonic missiles ahead of US, has the most advanced radar technology ahead of the US, advanced fighter planes and drones, which have stealth capability, closely approaching US capability. China has the most advanced robot soldiers and dogs, robot dogs, for war. And there is no equivalent today in the US or in India. Now, all of this shows you a line of thinking. India will never produce robot soldiers or robot dogs because you're not thinking in terms of offensive capability, only in terms of defense. China is planning in terms of offensive capability, not defensive. So that's where you see the big difference between these two players. And to come back to Maya's question, this is dragon and elephant. I don't know if dragon would be right. Dragons are generally friendly creatures, but in the subtle worlds, I mean. But this is much more. It is a violent and dominating dragon, let's put it that way. Advanced nuclear weapons in China continued to grow while the US and Russia had bound each other from the Cold War days into treaties that prevented them from testing or developing nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, China was developing them rapidly. So in the first tenure, Trump broke this agreement with Russia to allow both sides to develop to match China. And more recently, Trump actually revealed that Pakistan has been testing nuclear weapons secretly. And therefore, the US is justified in reviewing its nuclear testing. China also similarly is talking of all this. So we are really looking at a situation where you can't have a few countries being pacifist, US included, if others are not joining that. And if others continue to be dominant with aggressive intentions, then you need to match them in order to maintain the balance. I hope this phase will end soon. To be seen, though. So in the final end of this game, I spoke of tariffs as one part of the struggle. But there is a bigger challenge of control, and this is leading to the future of the world. Who governs the world eventually technologically will be those who govern artificial intelligence. In the media itself, we're seeing a huge artificial intelligence bubble. It will collapse. There will be a few players left, but the rapidity of growth of technology is still strong. So when it will collapse is difficult to predict. NVIDIA chips, which were largely under US control, Trump put restrictions on those chips sale uh, China to reduce or slow down China's capability. China, in turn, produced its counters to the US through rare earth controls on magnets and batteries against US and against India. So suddenly India found you cannot manufacture your electric cars because the high power motors require high-end magnets, which China has put restrictions on. So you found suddenly China wielding its power to bully other countries, to slow them all down, to strengthen its own economic capability. What did China do in response to Trump? It started building its own chipsets. So they are nowhere near capability of NVIDIA or the cutting edge of US chipsets. But what they did was, you can't build the same level of detail of nanometer scale of the chips, but what do you gain as a result, or what do you lose as a result? They are slightly slower, or they use up more heat. So it brought down the price of power to data centers, and at the same time started a whole new strategy to build new chips of its own for AI, which are designed and built locally. And because they had already built up the technology by taking all the capabilities from US. So unfortunately, this is happening a little late. China will build its own independence. It's a question of time. Another 5 years and they'll be equal perhaps to NVIDIA, who knows. But this national objective of being independent and to protect its own sovereignty technologically has been core of Chinese thinking from the beginning. And so US is a bit late in trying to restrain Chinese technological capability. Nevertheless, this is part of the game. And I don't see a problem there. Let China build its own capability. India should build its own capability and not be reliant on US. But it takes time. As I said, India is way behind. Modi has started this whole national mission for producing chips in India, but the technology there is still in the hands of a few elite companies. So it'll take a while for this shift to happen. Apple has shown interest to produce in India instead of China, but Trump is insisting Apple should produce in the US. It was one of those very crazy things when first the Apple phone came out. You opened the box and it said, designed in Cupertino, California. What do you mean designed? Everything else apart from that design was China. So you're proudly saying you just designed it, nothing else you did. That was a bit of a shock. When the first time I saw that, I said, my God, there's no shame even in this idea that you produced nothing. It was a matter of pride. They turned it into a matter of pride. Well, Trump wants to reverse that. He wants your phones, or those phones, Apple phones, to say manufactured in the US. And that's going to take a while. But what happens to India then? So there is pressure for them to manufacture in the US. It doesn't prevent them from manufacturing in India. So what you're seeing today is a huge disruption of global supply chain for a good reason. Because if you keep the current status, you need wars to ensure the same unbalanced, inequitable, hierarchical global financial system where if you have to be weak, India has to be five times weaker than the US, at least. Now it's maybe more. If it has to keep producing for export to the US, or China has to produce for export to US. The day all these become settled equitably, India may not need to produce for export primarily and can produce for its own needs. US will produce for its own need. China will produce for its own need. And maybe we export and exchange also. But this inequitable balance of labor also will shift. In other words, an Indian H-1B visa worker in the US is earning whatever 5 to 10 times more than the same guy working in India for the same thing. This will change. At some point, when all these even out, whether you work in India or in the US, you'll get approximately similar. Maybe a bit here and there. That's not important. If you're going there, what you spend will make up for what you earn, the same way as if you spend in India and what you earn in India. That would be an equitable financial approximate condition in the world. Now, I'm not saying this for all countries, US, India, Russia, China, maybe Europe as a whole, but it won't be true for every small country. Sri Lanka, for example, cannot be, it's not big enough for Apple to produce its phones there. So what will happen is smaller countries will align with local larger units. So Sri Lanka will align with India naturally because it's a cultural continuity and share in India's growth and well-being. And India will happily exchange. So they will each maintain their sovereignty, but as a whole bloc will be reasonably independent and complete among themselves. So if now you see this as a long-term vision of global economic trends and development to eliminate all wars once and for all. This is the direction Trump is pushing global economy through these high tariffs and other ways of pushing, pulling companies and redistributing the exchange mechanisms. In between is a bit of disruption, obviously. Suddenly, you were producing in Tirupur in India, for example, so many things for export to the US. And now you say, hey, the US is not going to buy from you anymore because it's too expensive. They're going to start manufacturing locally. What happens to your production? You'll have to review. Now you produce more for India and maybe export to a few other countries. Maybe it goes to China, maybe it goes to Europe. But so there's a gradual climb down from these unbalanced, unsustainable, and fake economic relationships to something which is more reasonable and more realistic and sustainable. This come down process is difficult because that's where you're restructuring things. One of the weird things which happened was Brazil had, I don't remember what it was, just saw this 2 days ago though. They were producing some goods and I think it was walnuts and some other nuts. And they exported to India because they couldn't go to the US. India had too few. So the goods come to India and suddenly there's a glut in India, prices fall. Unexpected. Nobody thought it would come from Brazil because all these years you were stuck. Everybody was stuck on exporting to the US. Now you're talking of mutual exchange. Fortunately, Modi set the base for mutual exchange way back, going back the last 10 years. So he's kind of prepared India for this. So India will benefit greatly through all the agreements made in the last 10 years. US is starting that business of building new agreements, but Trump is doing it very fast. China is in the process of struggling and bullying in the process of compelling other countries to fall in line to its interests. So I'm coming back to one big part of the story, which is Trump's style of diplomacy. This is where you're seeing a lot of the confusion. And the confusion is because Trump does not play diplomacy the usual way. So far, diplomacy was what happened behind the scenes. Your diplomats sat with other diplomats, they drank together, they ate together, they bought each other out to spy for each other's interests, bullied each other, and somebody's momentary interest or not decided policies for the whole country. Does not work. One of the big changes Modi made is all the diplomats sitting in Europe who were just having a good time doing nothing. They didn't care. They didn't understand India's needs and they didn't care at the end of the day. All these were replaced. Instead, diplomacy was brought back to Modi. But his style was much more conventional in that you go make friends, sign contracts, exchange goods, carry businessmen across in the aircraft to sign deals with each other. But it's kept low-key. Trump broke all that for two reasons. First, because anything he did, the media would attack him and highlight with a negative twist. So he's forced to state publicly, forcefully, what is his intention. So that the moment he does that forceful statement, the media takes that and says boastful, dominating, aggressive. They associate all these words. So the image in people's mind of Trump is aggressive, boastful, dominating, asserting himself. No, he's not asserting himself. He's asserting a national need and a critical need for global long-term interest to rebalance all these economic imbalances. And he's speaking openly so that what he has to say is understood and not warped by the media communication distorting it. So the diplomacy under Trump has had to undergo a major shift Modi tried to manage the same. He had a hostile media. What he did was went quiet, or today he's doing his diplomacy through others so that they don't attack Modi. And it is generally our famous Indian diplomat who's now suddenly Jaishankar, who's like a global figure because he speaks openly like Trump. Except because he's not the premier of the country, the media cannot say boastful. He's just saying it for what it is. Trump is saying it for what it is, but media can spin it. So, first shift is Trump tells it as it is and no apologies. You can know, advantages common man can know directly. Secrecy of negotiation is largely as if exposed, but I'll come back to that story. There's actually a whole negotiation behind the scenes which we don't know about. He's easy to misrepresent, which of course media is doing. And I gave example of how the BBC is even factually inventing quotations which are false. But what's happening behind the scenes is very interesting. So remember, Trump has a long-term interest of rebalancing these things. His approach generally has been, look, these are the facts. Here's what I'm offering you. Let's discuss. And if we can discuss in a friendly way, we'll come to a deal. He's a deal maker. If we cannot, then I will bully you and get what I want. So based on friendship or threat, one way or other, we have to renegotiate everything because US has had a bad deal going back now 50 years. So renegotiate all deals. Here's the interesting part. With India, it was easy. Friendly, India is open, Modi was open, it worked out, except when it came to certain things where India said no. So when India said we will not accept US agricultural produce, particularly with GMO products, India put a no there. So then Trump tried to squeeze there hard because they need to sell their agriculture somewhere. And if they want to really make up, why? See, so far US didn't care because they were printing money. The day you stop printing money, you have to exchange something real with other countries. You can't be selling aircrafts, fighter aircrafts for everyone when the wars stop. So what is US producing? Right now, the only thing it's producing largely is agricultural goods. So agricultural goods and services. That's the only thing he has to somehow get out there in the world to correct for the balance of payment. So pushing hard on India. Because if he can make one deal with Modi, it's like India represents 1/5 of the world, almost. So one deal will get him so much instead of dealing with 100 countries. Naturally, the squeeze is harder on India for those things which are advantageous. It's not against India. At the same time, he's also looking at protecting India from China, making the military deals. You saw something very interesting. While supposedly India is tense with US on negotiation of tariffs, suddenly, quietly, the defense minister is signing some major deals with the US and media hardly covers it. So showing you, and even the same defense minister says, things are not as they appear. He's talking about tariffs. He says negotiations happen on many levels for many different issues at the same time, and there's no conflict between them. These were hints that the government is not taking the tariff issue seriously. Of course, India is protecting India interest. US is protecting US interest, and we negotiate. So I'm coming to overall. There's no problem. There's no anti-India sentiment from Trump's side. He keeps saying Modi is a good friend, Indian people are great, etc. But cut back on H-1B where it is misused. Cut back on imports or push US exports where it is beneficial. Then comes to the whole question of Pakistan. What happened there? Suddenly, remember, it was in the first Trump presidency, Trump cut all funding to Pakistan terror, cut funding to Pakistan military, cut funding to Pakistan government. And more recently, all the funding which was going to so-called, it was all money basically going to the ISI, and there were funding coming from the US aid, supposedly going to aid whatever training of young people, and it was all going to the ISI quietly. All this was cut. Now what happens? Pakistan suddenly had a balance of payment crisis. At that point, it turned to China. China said, fine, we'll give you our military, we'll give you a plane, we'll give you everything in return for more control over Pakistani highway linking to China, going through India and other facilities within Pakistan. Pakistan doesn't want that. But there's no other option. And that's when Trump came in and said, look, we will wean you off China. We won't give you the weapons. We'll give you other things. We'll give you the loans you need to get your economy back in shape. And we make a deal, economic deals with Pakistan, weaning off Pakistan from China, and at the same time cutting down on the terror funding network which was happening. So it's a big deal right now. You see in Pakistan, the huge terror attacks taking place. We don't hear much of that in India. A lot of it is coming from the Baloch region. A lot of it is coming from the Taliban's, which initially Pakistan was making deals with them. Suddenly those deals collapse and you don't have the money, the deals collapse. And Pakistan is coming under attack from the Taliban. And you see internally there's a lot of open discussion about Pakistan having made strategic errors with aligning with the Taliban, etc. In the midst of all this, Trump invites the head of Pakistani military to have lunch with him. I mentioned this last time. It's weird. He's not inviting the head of state because he understands this is the man controlling Pakistan. He's the military head who controls the civilian head. He is also product of the ISI and probably controls ISI, the present military head who appointed himself field marshal, etc. Trump sits with him. Officially, it's lunch. And Trump comes out patting back and says, oh, wonderful, we are great friends, Pakistan is a great ally, etc. What's happening behind the scenes? And you see Trump's style of negotiation. Very friendly, very gentle, but hard, where he says, look, these are the facts. We need your help with Iran. We need your help with settling Taliban. We need you to disengage from China. And we need you to stop the war with India and stop funding terrorists. Get this done. We will help you all this. Are you willing to negotiate? If they don't, then you'll get the squeeze. If they do, Trump continues. After lunch, he says, hey, we had a great time. We're making great deals, great exchanges. And the interesting part is immediately after, US companies gain entrance into Pakistan. Just a few months before, 2 months before, I think, Microsoft officially shut down its Pakistan sales center. Several major companies from the US were pulling out of Pakistan because of increasing collapse of not only economy, but society itself. Too much terrorism and no safety, no security. Here, Trump makes a deal and suddenly now US companies again begin to enter Pakistan. That's the only way you're going to rebuild the economy. Understand, Pakistan is not your enemy if it stops funding terror. Pakistani people are Indian people. So don't look at Pakistan as an enemy. Understand the enmity was at the level of the military controls and the deep state and cabal controls within Pakistan. The common people are Indian people. There's no enmity there. And the only way out is eliminate that top leadership control and rebuild economy on a more equitable and friendly basis. Can this be done? That's the challenge Trump has in dealing with Pakistan. And he has taken the challenge head on. The media in India is saying, oh, you should isolate Pakistan, you should cut off all contact, etc. Yes, that worked up to a point. But eventually, if you continue isolation, Pakistan will turn in desperate measures to China or others. And Trump is preventing that and rebuilding as if a new engagement on the basis of, well, his terms, which are no wars, no terrorism, and none of the usual extremism. Come back to reality, rebuild in a good, equitable way, which benefits both Pakistan and the US. So Pakistan has some rare earths and exchanging deals with Taliban, whatever. I don't need to go into detail, but you understand the rationale behind is very different. It's not against India. The same game Trump did in his diplomacy when he sat with Coca-Cola. So publicly he came out, hey, Coca-Cola is so great. They have just agreed to bring back cane sugar in and replace whatever was before. And Trump makes a big deal about it. I talked to them and they agreed. So wonderful. Aren't they nice guys? When it actually negotiations took place, he presents a very strong picture. Look, you're doing this. You're killing American people. You're not doing that in Europe. Either you change now, go by these values and standards, or we will put a really hard squeeze. So there's a threat behind the scenes. When they agree, he makes a big deal about friendship. He knows exactly what they are. He knows exactly the game being played. That's his style of negotiation. And it comes from he's a follower of Sun Tzu's Art of War, where one of the things taught is, when you're strong, pretend you're weak. When you're weak, pretend you're strong. So you always keep the enemy confused. And he actually plays that wonderfully. One of the great capabilities of Trump, and you have to understand this is a master businessman. You have to see his life before he entered politics and see how well he did. And one of the great capabilities of this man is the ability to create confusion, sow confusion in the enemy's mind when necessary, and utilize the confusion to extract from it a positive outcome. This is very difficult to do. There are very few people who can do this in the world. Most of them are in the domain of business. There are practically no politicians capable of doing this. It needs a huge vitality, it needs a huge experience. Most politicians know how to win elections. They don't know how to manage and organize or uh, govern. Very few people in politics in the world who are capable of good governance. Modi learned the hard way. He didn't have it. He was a good organizer, but governance is a different deal. He could organize programs and events, but he learned governance while in Gujarat for nearly 12 years and then brought that capability to Delhi, and there he had to relearn governance on a national scale. First 4 years were mostly wasted in relearning, but he's built the capability. It's still narrow. It's still not able to wield on a large scale. He's hesitating. He's afraid to take large leaps and big risks. So he goes safely, occasionally makes major shifts, and that's about it. Trump, on the other hand, is a master governor. He knows how to govern. He would have made a good, genuine emperor in the past. If you look at history, some of the great emperors who were there, they had this kind of power who could expand an empire or build and organize an empire. Very few of that capability. And Trump very likely has that from some past incarnation. What he is doing is actually governing and under governance, reshaping the entire governance structure, not only of the US economy, but global economy, because he can do it. There is nobody else in the world who is capable of this kind and sitting in that chair. So first of all, it had to be in the US, because US still controls the world's military and world's economy. Financial center might be New York, London, whatever. That's different. It's controlling economy is a different deal. And from there to govern the global framework of governance. It's a huge shift, and only this man is able to do this. While he is there, if basic structural changes can be brought about, then you will have the dollar rapidly falling in its value, but without collapsing the economy. This is an extraordinary skill Trump has. He's bringing back manufacturing. He's creating jobs in the US. Dollar value is falling, but without the dollar falling. This is amazing. What he has done effectively is there is huge inflation across the world, but without the dollar collapsing. So you will see the rupee weakening. Europe will weaken. Chinese yuan will weaken against dollar, but dollar will stay strong. How does that work? This is a skill, and it's a skill of managing the whole economics in a certain way. And that's the reason why when he says that the US federal bank is still keeping rates too high, it needs to be brought down, etc. And they're resisting because they don't want this to succeed. They want to sink the economy. They want to create turmoil and trouble. They want to keep the US weak economically, whatever interests are behind in the cabal interest. And so Trump is playing all these things at the same time. He has got NATO to start funding its own wars or its own equipment, where earlier US was funding everything. Well, they were printing money, so it didn't matter. But if you want to stop printing money, NATO has to be paid for by its own internal countries. So Trump started that process in his first presidency. He's pretty much completed it now. And he's got clear commitments. Those countries are paying for NATO. US is pulling out everywhere. So you don't need to print paper money. You don't need to have wars anymore to sustain the global economy. And at the same time that you are ending wars, you are also keeping the US at some level of technological forefront and without collapsing the US economy. So this is one of the great things Trump has done, is doing. With this background, you'll understand why what he's doing is so important. And he has 4 years to finish this, or 4 years to finish it to a point where it's self-sustaining. It's difficult. It's not easy. Undoing 50 years of the very opposite, let's say. It's not over yet. I want to point out two more things which are critical in, I would hope to finish this discussion today if we can. So one of the big things which was cause of US decline was drugs coming into the US. The CIA in the past actually funded drugs coming into US to earn money to pay for its own clandestine operations, for its own clandestine wars and all other interests. At some point, the CIA, as the core of the cabal, global cabal, wanted to sink the young people across the world, but starting with the US, that there is no future when youngsters die of drug addiction. Trump has reversed this. He's still doing, but he's already reversed the game. How? So in his first presidency, he started the whole process of stopping this drug incursions, etc. First presidency, he could not go all out because there was a problem. He needed to get elected a second time. So certain things is set in place. Implementation was slow and gradual. This presidency, he's not thinking whether he comes back or not is irrelevant. So what he's doing, he's going all out against the drugs. How? You can't stop the drug addict by saying, hey, stop addiction. Yes, those systems were put in place, but that takes time. You can't stop the distribution in the US saying, hey, we have to go after the criminals who distribute. You want to stop the drug addiction problem, stop at the entry of the drugs in the country. How do you do that? US has this huge sea line where people can basically come in a little boat and get anything across anywhere. It's very difficult. And bulk of this was coming from Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, and they were basically walking across or swimming across or coming in boats and transferring things. What did the US Trump do under this? Particularly, what happened is Venezuela, the head of Venezuela today is basically a despot. He lost the election. He forced his way in, and Maduro is illegitimate. But Trump said very openly, he controls the Tren de Aragua cartel and is smuggling drugs openly with government support. So what Trump did was he announced that this is effectively war, where the head of state is actively part of the cartel that smuggles drugs across to the US. And something very interesting I saw for the first time in the media statements. So far, whenever there's a drug haul, let's say in India, Chennai airport customs had a drug haul of 1.6 crores worth of street level worth of whatever, cocaine or something. They only talk of money. What Trump did, he changed the game. He said, this will kill 60,000 Americans and ruin the lives of another 400,000. You see the bomb. You're carrying a bomb in a boat which will kill 60,000 people and 400,000 will suddenly go out of job or their lives will be ruined. That's your bomb. The whole thinking changes. Now, it's not about so many $1 million worth street level price. This is bomb which is going to harm your people. What do? You shoot a missile and blow it out of the waters. Because if you go and arrest them, then you have all the process which will take 20 years. And even in the US, you just arrested who? People who are carriers of the drugs who have nothing to do with the cartel. The cartel hires these cheap laborers, let them go to jail. The cartel continues its job. They were carrying drugs in submarines. They're taking submarines from Venezuela across the Atlantic and entering Spanish waters in submarines, carrying drugs. So Trump teamed up, informing the Spanish people, here's a submarine coming, arrest them, knock them. They sank them in this case recently. But in the US, as they're approaching, they're told, go back from helicopter. If they don't go back, they're shot, blown out. Now, you've stopped the full consignment coming in. You go at the same time after the cartel heads. In this case, happens to be also the head of state. But when you go in this way, none of the low-level workers will ever accept to bring your drugs across. You end the pipeline where it enters, and you treat it as a war because it's killing people. It's not about how much money someone makes. It's about how many lives are lost or ruined. And so the whole the thinking has been shifted. And because Venezuela then threatened to go all out using their military to promote the drug sales, so Trump put ships there. It's not going to go to war. He's not interested in starting a war. But if needed, he might just topple, if they can, he might topple Maduro. That's to be seen. To me, that's irrelevant. The real war is against the drug flow, and that has to be stopped one way or other. So this is one of the major shifts which took place. Interestingly, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to this Maria Machado, who is anti-government head. And when she got the prize openly, publicly, she dedicated her Peace Prize to Trump, saying it is because of Trump that what I'm doing is possible. And that shows you in Venezuela, the people understand what the game is. The media, of course, spun it saying, oh, Trump is desperate for the Peace Prize, so she gave it to him just to please him. No, it has nothing to do with that. It's a genuine recognition that she has survived there. She's doing what she can because of the backing that she's receiving on the other side. And of course, yes, there's a question in the chat box. Somebody said that I had said Trump did not speak of price. Yes, at that time. But yes, he has spoken of it subsequently. He made this statement that he has stopped 8 wars. And he certainly, if anyone deserves such a prize, he definitely does. But he said he will not get it. And that's fine. He's not doing it for the prize. That was his point. He's doing it because it needs to be done. So this is one of the important statements I wanted to make about this prize. And let me complete what I wanted to say. Yes, he stopped many wars. There's still the story about him stopping the India-Pakistan war. I'd explained this before, but it comes back to the fact that he was right. He actually pressured Pakistan to end it and not go nuclear. He didn't pressure India because India was ready to stop the moment Pakistan agreed to certain terms. And so India is right. Modi is right saying that they never asked Trump and there's no third party involvement. Modi is right. But Trump is also right saying he stopped it because he did pressure Pakistan, prevented them from going nuclear, and then did whatever was needed to ensure that they don't go that way again. One of the very interesting things which has come out now from Pakistan, a lot of news is leaking out from some of their senior military people. One of the statements that has come out is that the Pakistani nuclear weapons were already put under US control under General Musharraf. So this is going way back 30 years ago or something. And they were already under US control. And when India had shot its missiles to the nuclear base command control center, and I had mentioned this, one of the missiles had hit straight there, gone through underground and burst. It had US personnel there. That became one of the points of contention for the US to intervene also. So in any case, it's not a big problem. He is right. Again, you do not see the media telling you that he actually brokered a deal between, what was it, Thailand and Indonesia, and then in Africa between several countries. He got them to sign deals, and the media is completely quiet mostly on this is happening. And all the peace efforts, which he has successfully implemented, all within 1 year, media is largely ignoring. And this shows you overall intentions are in the right direction. Coming back to the economy, I want to make a few passing comments. Trump is for crypto. He's for the shift to gold. And early on in his tenure, he made this very interesting comment. He said, I'm going to go to Fort Knox, where US gold is stored, and verify if the gold is still there. Do you know why? Because in the last 50 years, nobody has actually done an audit of how much gold actually exists. And we don't know if it's been stolen in the meantime. Why is this important? Because Trump wants to go back to the gold standard for a stable economy globally. And if the gold is missing, then you can't do that. So he's ensuring that all the pieces are in place for a strategy which hopefully by the end of his term might go to a gold standard. What you see across the world, all the big countries are buying up gold like crazy while the price is low. Unfortunately, now it's too late. Already price, I think, has shot up some 65% in the last 1 year, if I remember my numbers right. But all of them had been buying up gold meanwhile quietly. Still going on. There's going to be a burst probably in silver and gold, and crypto, of course, will go up. But all this is basically compensating for the massive global inflation. And the inflation is because all the paper money printed, not only by the US, all companies, is by all countries, is gradually sinking. And that's what is making anything of real estate or real value to go up to compensate for the sinking value of this. So there is a huge transition taking place to a completely new global economic order, largely driven by Trump's actions, and which will hopefully not require any more wars. And only the US could do this, and only Trump in the US can do this. That's why, to me, this is so important. There's nobody else in any other country, for that matter, or no other leader in the US, in the current politics at least, who had that capability. Even if you see within his party, all those who are allied with him, the capability that he has to wield this kind of a global level of restructuring, that kind of power wielding capability nobody has so far. Maybe others will develop. But he had that, and he is being used for this as an instrument by a higher force, which is obviously working through him. And because he has a certain opening and a certain good intention in his vision, with a strong, very powerful, tamed vital, that this is possible. So from a spiritual perspective, This is what I would add in terms of his ability as an instrument for a higher force. Is he conscious? Irrelevant. Elon Musk is a great instrument. Is he conscious? Probably not from some of his comments, which we see, but he's still a powerful instrument, and a lot of great work is being done through him. Modi is the only one I would say is conscious of his spiritual side and the fact that he's consciously serving a higher purpose. He has a strong vital, trained, but nowhere near the capability that Trump has. But he's growing. And because of that opening to the higher force, his capacity is growing rapidly in terms of what you see across 10 years. Hopefully, he will be able to do much more in the next few years. But we are at one of the most amazing, interesting transition points in global economics and global history. So I'm going to quickly go through chat box. Spoken a lot. It's almost time we have to stop, but Piklu has a question about Women's World Cup winning by India. For me, women's, men's, these differences are symbolic. But the fact that India could put forward a team that could win shows two things: that you did not have political corruption in the team selection and the team training, and that actually the government spent money to give them the necessary resources to build their competence and capability and take them all the way through to the global winning level. Whether they win next time or not, to me, is secondary. But that the government could support a people's capacity and take them up to the point where they could play on that level. That's important, which earlier was never there. If India won at any point, it was because of individual effort going all the way through with zero government support. India has huge talents in every field. It's one of the most rich and diverse in terms of capabilities and numbers, of course. So anywhere where India as a whole sets its eyes to set high standards, you will reach. Not a problem. But it needs competent support, capabilities, sometimes technical supports. And for that, you can't do on an individual level because you don't have the finances. It takes money. So any world level championship of anything, any field, requires a certain financial basis for the last bit of training that requires you to go to that grade. So India has the raw material, you can go very far, but then last bit of grade training, Modi started when he first took power. So over 10 years, a lot has happened. So it's a sign that things are working and we don't have anymore the corruption which used to be before in the field of sports. And that has been cleaned up. So to me, these are all positive signs. I'm not too concerned about whether they actually won or they were second or third. That they reached that grade and were able to sustain something of value there. Yes, Tutun says many people think that international relations, India and China should come together and work together in BRIC nations. Yes, I would believe all countries. And it's not against someone else. Ideally, you see, if you think of yourself as a family, everybody who has a great strength or capability should be sharing and helping others. I've shared once long back the example of the Gujarati Patel community. These are in the US. They own something like 80% of the hotels. So I was told there when I went, the person told me he was from that community. So he says 80% of US hotels are owned by the Patel Gujarati community. 80% of the Patel community come from one single village in India, from Gujarat. Something to that effect. Numbers maybe here and there a bit. But what happens? Then he explained to me, if tomorrow somebody comes and says, I'm from India, Patel community, you don't know him. You'll say, oh, whose relation, this, that, oh, brother of uncle of this relative's that friend. Okay. You want to work? I will give you the training. I will loan you the money and help you start your own hotel. Why would you do that? Because you're family. And this is very different from the Western model of economics where you are competition. I need to ensure you never grow so that I remain the only business. That's the US thinking. It's war to eliminate the enemy. Whereas in a family, you are helping someone else to become independent. And well, overall, you will grow together. There's plenty. It's a different mindset. If this family mindset can be brought into international politics among countries, then we will all be helping each other and Earth as a whole will grow. At that point, we'll be ready to have diplomatic relations with beings from other planets. Or maybe when they're on the edge, we'll have a diplomatic intervention from one of these planets and say, hey, you guys, stop your wars, then we will have a relation with you. I don't know how it'll go, which one will happen first. Maybe both together. But this thinking has to change. And the Communist Party of India, with its communist ideology of dominance, has to let that go and become China. Make China great, sure. Make India great, sure, and work together. That's the thinking of Trump. So you see, in his engagement, he will never say, so and so is bad. He will say, oh, this is my friend. He's a good man. I know he'll do a good deal. He'll say bad only to someone who's really, really bad. In this case, Maduro. He will say Maduro has to go, when Venezuela prime president. These are really corrupt, crude crooks, owners of the cartel which have destroyed lives. And there he will call out who is bad. There he says it. Otherwise, when it comes to negotiation, even when political rivals have won, he said, okay, congratulations. But when someone's bad, he will tell you, okay, this man, he's going to ruin the economy, he's going to do this. And every time he has said that, you'll see in a few years down, you'll see he's been right. So man is coming from genuine goodwill. And this should be hopefully the new standard of global relations. But we're still far from that. It will take a while. Okay, so Piklu has a question about chaos in Bengal. I'm going to keep that for the last if you want. Yes, Piklu, Tutun says that Swami Kriyananda, disciple of Yogananda, warned that US was printing dollars which would lead to collapse of US economy in the future. Yes, so the goal is hopefully we won't have a collapse, but there'll be a gradual decline. And Piklu says, yes, there was a discussion to bypass dollar using the BRICS summit. Yes, very interesting there. Trump came out with a serious warning. He says, if BRICS goes and makes an independent currency, and we have the capacity, BRICS could do that. US could do nothing about it. He says, if you go to that, I'll treat it as war and I will ensure you economically break down. That was a threat he put. And you have to be, in the context of what I discussed, you have to understand that statement. It was serious. And he wants to ensure US economy does not collapse. That's his job. He's a US president, not global president. So, but it will be done in a way that it does not destroy others. And obviously, this is a difficult transition. It's very tricky to manage. Okay. So, there are people who don't like Trump. They will say he's this and he's that. To me, it doesn't matter. What you have to see what he does and how that aligns to the global evolutionary interests. So I'm not concerned with comments about is he a bully, is he not. He comes with good intentions, goodwill, and doing overall what is good for the US and good for the world. So to me, that's good enough. So Jerry is saying that somebody's article on Trump's role in pushing transhumanism and eugenics, I frankly don't know much about that. So even people are worried about Musk pushing for eugenics and transhumanism. I would put it very simply. There are technologies which are untested. They have a positive potential and they have a negative potential. At some point, the technology itself becomes so accessible that someone will use it anyway. So it's better it is done in the open. So we understand its strengths and its weaknesses and limits, and then we put in place mechanisms to ensure that it's not misused. But beyond a certain point, you cannot even control. For example, what is possible today with the genetic technology in a home lab, sitting at home, you can do things. You can take a plant. You can take a gene from an animal, insert it into the plant, make the plant glow, make the plant change color, do anything. And you cannot control it. So what you do is you put certain ethical framework in research which can be controlled, but beyond that you can't. So it's my same comment about things like this, transhumanism, eugenics. Yes, it's going to happen anyway. And what Elon Musk has created, for example, with implanting a chip in the brain that allows somebody who's blind to be able to see, it's technology and it's a skill of capabilities that we have to develop eventually, because it's possible. If it's possible, eventually we will do it. Then will it be misused? To be seen. What is even its potential of misuse? So it's better these things are done in transparency before us than in some secret military lab and then used secretly, quietly to control humanity. And that's my approach generally to such technologies. Utkarsh is saying, what about Trump's crypto earnings? Media makes him to be corrupt. Well, I'll show you many billionaires who have made a lot of money with crypto earnings. Trump is not alone. He saw this coming, invested in it, and he's made money. Why not? If you can, you would have done it also. Just because he happens to be also a president of the US does not make him, he doesn't have to sell away all his goods. He's doing his thing, but he's doing it in a way that benefits the global and the US economy. That's the point you have to look at. And his family, obviously, but if anybody had told you 5 years, 10 years ago that Bitcoin will go to these heights, and I had friends telling me this, that Bitcoin will reach 100,000, and it was done with remote viewing at a time when Bitcoin was 5,000. I said, wow, is that even possible? But it's coming from remote viewing. It must be true because these guys were some of the elite. I never invested in it. I should have. It was not my type. It's not my thinking. I said, okay, that's going to be a fun thing to watch. That's how it went. But here is a businessman. A businessman doesn't say, here's a fun thing to watch, an opportunity. He seizes the opportunity and he makes money. I'd see no problem with that. So media, remember, do not trust the media. They have a way of spinning and warping and twisting things. If we get a chance, maybe the next time we have a discussion on current affairs, I will share with you an example of how perversely, deliberately they twist facts just to create an impression. So Revati is asking, is an economically stable Pakistan good for us? Their only mission seems to become strong to destroy us, meaning India. The strong comments of Asim Munir made from the American soils were deplorable. Yes, the problem is not Pakistan and the Pakistanis. The problem is the military elite and the political elite, which are largely cabal controlled or perverse. And they need to provoke fear or hate for India to stay in power. Because the moment you remove fear or hate, the common man asks, well, why are we separate? We are the same family, we are the same people. Just because somebody decided to draw a line and suddenly declared that this is the religion is going to be different, that doesn't make us separate. So there's a real problem for those who are ruling Pakistan to continue to rule as a separate entity. What will happen, hopefully, is that this elite gradually will become irrelevant. Common man wakes up, maybe a more stable economy builds, and then we have engagements between India and Pakistan, which are of a mutually beneficial economic exchange, and a kind of a local, regional, let's say, economic integration takes place. Something like what India has done with Sri Lanka or has been doing with many of the Southeast Asian countries. Bangladesh, it was in the right direction until this extremism took over. You see also how the media lies to you. When this when this military takeover took place in Pakistan and legally elected government was overthrown, the media was fawning over this Nobel laureate. Supposedly he would set things right. Under Bangladeshi constitution, within 3 months they had to have elections. 1 year has passed nearly. No elections. Nobody's even talking about it. Who's raising the voice and saying, hey, you're not going by your constitution? Nobody cares. Why? Because the interests that did the overthrow want to ensure that you remain numb and do not even think about Bangladesh, the atrocities, or what they're going to do next as regards their objectives with regard to Bangladesh. You are being played royally. So distrust the media, especially when they make a big noise against someone. Ask yourself, what is the good thing this person is doing that media wants you not to see? And then you'll begin to see what's happening behind the scenes. Okay, so Utkarsh has this important question about Indian people being criticized or misrepresented in a particular part of Trump's clientele or his electorate, who are hardcore Christians. So yes, Trump has the backing of hardcore Christians. Why? Because his values align with their values. He's not a hardcore Christian. he is a very open and cultural and multi-religious open mind. But the extreme Christian groups are backing him. So it is easy to get a statement from one of these extreme Christian groups and say, Trump's electorate is saying this. Not true. They're a part of Trump's electorate. So that's again a mischief that the media plays. And they do that even in India. They will find in a particular group, let's say the BJP has many supporters, it's a majority winning party. Find someone who voted for the BJP and get him to say something nasty about whatever it is you want. And say, see, Modi's supporters are saying this. They are saying they are disappointed with Modi, or they are against, make him say some extremist statement. And they will play this to make and generalize it as if all of them are saying it. Perhaps some have said it. Perhaps some of them are in a position of power and have made some pretty narrow religious statements, or they don't know enough about India and they've made some nasty statements about caste or other story. Yes, but it doesn't represent Trump's thinking. He just happens to be in Trump's cabinet or somebody who's loyal supporter or part of the party or something like that. And yes, there are people like that. You have to see, does this actually come into Trump's policies or in his government's policies? If it comes there, that is a serious issue. But if a person who is in his government makes some stupid statement, one should not give too much importance to it. But if you can, reach out, put the counter, as many Indian groups in the US have done. There is the Hindu American Foundation and various other groups like this, which have made public statements to counter such things and to set right the discourse. That needs to be done. It's a constant, active, ongoing process, because human beings tend to be narrow and limited. And especially when you work in a large complex where different kinds of interest groups come together, there are a lot of mutual misunderstandings. These need to be resolved. For that, you have to speak up. But you don't start by assuming that they're out there to harm you. You reach out and see if you can create some kind of a mutual agreement. I remember there was one group led by Swami Dayananda in India who made friends with, they had an interaction with Israeli people and said the swastika is for us a sacred sign in India. The Nazi used that symbol. They never called it a swastika, by the way. That was imposed in the public discourse by the media, who used the Hindu term swastika for the Nazi symbol, which is called some Croen something. Sorry, I forget the name. They used a very different term. It's one of the runes from the Teutonic tradition. Swastika word was taken from India. Nazis never used it. But as a result, swastika is associated with Nazism, and in India you worship the swastika or you use it as a religious symbol. So he had a dialogue with the elite Jewish leadership of the religion, where they made these things clear and ensured that there was no misunderstanding when Indians use the swastika. It has nothing to do against the Jews or pro-Hitler or other thing. So this kind of mutual interaction is absolutely necessary, and there are groups doing it, and you should also, if it is within your space, to do. But don't get carried away by media promoting, saying that Trump group or Trump's supporters are against Hindus. Maybe a few, but that's not policy for Trump, nor a policy for his government. And that is the distinction you must maintain. Yes, could have says, was losing Charlie Kirk a loss for a probable US president? He was definitely of a very high standard of competence. The way he was able to argue rationally with clarity, coming from a strong Christian tradition, he's a good example. He said in many cases when somebody had a different position from his Christian position, he said, I disagree with you. This is my Christian position. As a Christian, I stand by this and I don't agree with you on that point, on a religious point. But I accept your right to follow that practice or that belief or whatever it is. And so he's a good example of the Trump base who has a wider viewpoint. And Trump is broadly in the same framework. And there are many who are like that. And he went around from college to college, speaking to people in these terms, bringing forward for what he called Christian values. To me, they are largely human values, family values, etc. But fine, In the West, they are associated with Christianity, or in the US at least, they call them Christian values. To me, they are equally Hindu values or lasting values of family and other traditions. And in that sense, he played a huge role in waking up young people, but also on a very high level of quality and depth of discourse with clarity. And when they eliminated him, that was a huge setback. I hope, though, that others of his grade of competence will also come up and build that kind of a capacity. When there are enough people, the Asuric forces cannot eliminate all. But when there's only one, you can change the future by eliminating the one person. And so you must understand this is part of the struggle of evolution. We need good people, we need competent people to come into domain of public space, and it's very hard, very difficult. If you see the kind of attacks he had, even on other levels, verbal and social media and others, and the strength and the resilience to be able to withstand that, it's difficult. It needs a very strong, disciplined, clear, vital, integrated with a higher developed intellect and open to higher spiritual inspiration. That's what this man had. So he's an exceptional instrument, was presidential material for sure. And his loss is a great loss for sure. Okay. Utkarsh says, I'm Arya Samaji. I would like to talk about Swami Dayanand and Sri Aurobindo's thoughts on him. His story has been a great inspiration. I don't know if you remember referring to what I mentioned, Swami Dayanand. This was a different Swami Dayanand Saraswati. There are several with that name, but yes, so Sri Aurobindo certainly knew of Swami Dayanand's work. At that time, he was a social reformer nearly 100 years ago. Social reformer, but also he brought back the deeper study of the Veda and things in that direction. Sri Aurobindo actually said that what Swami Dayanand says is true about the Vedas, but there's actually much more than he has said. So it's really a starting point of an awakening that took place. And so maybe I'll close with this part of the discussion. I was recently in France, and for a lecture jointly done with Mark O'Byrne. And Mark had an unusual experience at one point. He was in a what they call yoga class with asanas. And instead of doing the class, he found himself out of his body, surrounded by a group of about 10 men and one woman. And they were old, very aged, but very young in quality of consciousness, laughing. And they said to him that they are the founders of what today survives as the Veda. And their message to him was, they showed him certain other things which he has not shared publicly. But what they showed him was that we are at a point of transition in human affairs, where once again the knowledge and the inspiration of the Veda has to come forward. And along with that, also, there's a huge shift taking place on the earth in terms of the collective consciousness. So these are the two key points that Mark has shared. And subsequently, he had another experience where he was taken out of the body by one of the Vedic deities and taken over some space over North India and shown certain things, which again he has not shared publicly. But I found in this something very interesting, and Mark on his own was inspired to organize a discussion on the Veda and the teaching of the Veda in current context. So I was in France for this. One of these programs was this thing we did jointly. And it was fascinating to see how much interest there is in that space for this kind of a deeper and higher learning. So I think we have to stop now because we've crossed our time. It's the topic which I had taken, global disruption, so that a broad framework I'm placing. It's not going too much into details, not necessary. Once you understand this big picture of what is happening and the nature of this transition, you will be able to hopefully interpret current events from a lens that will make you understand more deeply and not be clouded by media distortions or deceptions. And second reason for me to show you, actually there's a positive line. It looks like a major disruption, major confusion. It's a good thing because we're transitioning from what was a perverse, unsustainable, imbalanced arrangement to something more equitable, more sustainable, and potentially more harmonious framework of global economic relations between countries. So if you understand this big picture, you will not be worried, and you will know also to, ask for, pray for, work for the right thing to happen. That was my intention. Another questions maybe we'll keep for later. Feel free to send questions. I'll come back to our main topic of discussion from next time, but things to do with current affairs we might take up again after a month or two, perhaps, if necessary. Let's take a moment to recenter ourselves in this larger vision, and which aligns very closely to Sri Aurobindo's own description of what is necessary for the new global order. The United Nations, he had pointed out, was inequitable, and it had particularly this way where a few countries held the veto power to override others. That became the point for bullying, as well as inability for countries to come together on a real basis. It was only in alignment to these exceptional powers. That has to go. And if it cannot happen through the UN, it has to happen by other means. UN has become largely corrupt and irrelevant. Trump is bypassing the UN completely. And hopefully he's moving in this direction where a more equitable basis of relations between countries can develop. And with this, there has to be a shift in human consciousness. If that does not happen, all these external changes will not be enough. If that can happen, then despite the external imbalances, we will find a way to set them right and build more lasting human relations. This should be our direction of work, and hopefully what we have seen aligns broadly. For the first time, I will say there is actually hope, and we might end up seeing much of this happening, at least the direction set in our lifetime over the coming years. Let's pray for that and pray for the Divine Mother's help for the best to happen through instruments who might be conscious or unconscious. It's irrelevant. But through us, if we can be conscious instruments, more and more of what is necessary for the divine will and harmony to work should be done. This should be our earnest effort and prayer. Namaste.